Okay, so now having covered Kant and then Keteb on dignity, we are now moving on to John Stuart Mill's on liberty. The footprint of John Stuart Mill in the Declaration of Human Rights is probably not quite as big or noticeable as that of Kant, but there's no question that it's there, and it plays some very important roles, especially in the earlier part, the earlier articles of the Declaration. So there's no real problem in thinking of Mill as one of the foundational thinkers for later human rights theorists. Now, Mill was... Mill, as you can see, was alive through most of the 1800s. He was the son of a Scottish philosopher who was close friends with Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is commonly taken to be the progenitor of utilitarianism. So utilitarianism, I touched on it very briefly in the Kant lecture. The briefest conceptualization, or the pithiest way of putting it, is utilitarianism is about the greatest good for the greatest number. That's sort of the organizing principle of utilitarian morality. Now, utilitarianism and the deontology of Kant, as I said, they don't really get along. They're not friends. And so it's curious to see then these two different philosophical traditions nonetheless taking up very important roles in the Declaration. So I'll leave it to you to assess whether you think they're in conflict with one another in any important ways. But for the meantime now, I just want to get a handle on what it is that Mill is driving at around ideas of free speech, free thought, the free exchange of ideas, of opinion, as he would put it. And it's probably important to note at the outset here that when he talks about opinion, he's giving it a little bit more weight and stature than we're commonly inclined to think of it. So currently, it would not be all that unusual to hear someone say, oh, well, that's just your opinion, as a way of dismissing something, as if to say, because it's just your opinion, it's not, say, supported by evidence, or it's not anything more robust than that. The way that Mill is thinking of opinion is something more, at least in principle, more robust, more well supported, especially when opinions are allowed to come into contact with one another, with their opposites, and test themselves against one another. Now, he lays out in the introduction, which I didn't assign, just gave you that as an optional reading, a couple of principles that are very important. He says, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their member is self-protection. So then you're not warranted, you're not allowed, you can't make any claim to interfere with anyone else's action except as a matter of self-protection. He goes on, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So again, there's this notion that it's only in order to keep others from experiencing harm at your hand that anyone can exercise power against your will over you. We'll come back, not in this lecture, but in a later lecture, to his idea of harm. It becomes one of the central figures in his philosophy of liberty. but we don't get to it quite in this lecture. So here we're just talking about liberty of thought and discussion, that first opening chapter of his piece. Now, right from the outset, he pitches the free press as this kind of stopgap against tyranny. That the free press is one of the things that that frustrates tyranny. So we can see then that Mill takes free thought and free discussion, the open exchange of ideas, to be absolutely crucial defenses against tyranny and against corruption. So that any constraint on the free exchange of ideas then, in his view, is going to allow tyranny to get a toehold. And this is the thing that he wants to push back against. So to this end, he proposes that freedom of speech entails the freedom to profess any doctrine, however immoral people might find it. He sticks to this conviction in the end for 4 reasons. 1, any forcibly silenced opinion may in fact be true. But if it's silenced, we would have no way of knowing that. We couldn't discover the truth of the silenced opinion because it's been silenced. So that would be a deprivation to us. Secondly, even an opinion that is not true can still contain some truth. It might be mistaken in some particular way, but it can still contain some truth. On the other hand, prevailing opinions, the dominant opinions of the day, are seldom the whole truth. It's hard even sometimes to think what that would be, what the whole truth would look like. Why? Because prevailing opinions typically don't capture the whole truth of anything. So it's only the conflict between opinions that gives us a hope of gaining full truth. Third, even when received opinion, that by received opinion he means opinion that is prevalent, that we just sort of take for granted, we accept it, we receive it unquestioningly. Even when received opinion is the whole truth, most people will hold it as a prejudice, so they'll exercise it as a prejudice against varying opinions, rather than understanding its rational grounds. So another way to think of this is you take the prejudice to prejudge, so then you take it as a prejudgment rather than gaining an understanding of what lies underneath, what the rational basis is for it. So in other words, it's like holding an opinion without understanding where that opinion comes from, what makes it valid, what makes it robust. Now, the way around that is to have other opinions to contest it, so that even if they're mistaken, going through the process of defending your received opinion against opposition compels you to work out what the rational basis of that opinion is. And then you can hold it in a more vital way. It's more alive for you. And it's something about which you now have a deep understanding rather than just accepting it kind of as doctrine. And this brings us to 4, an extension of the third point. The meaning of the doctrine can lose its effect on conduct. So it can't be a guide to your conduct if it's just formally professed. It's prevented then from developing any real conviction. Another way of putting this is to say it simply becomes dogma. So when you just repeat it as dogma, you're not considering it. You're not thinking about what it implies for you or for others. In a way, this is not his wording, but you could say you're taking it on faith rather than taking it as reasoned out. So then those are the conclusions. That I've jumped right to the end of the piece to get those 4 items. And so those are the conclusions that he drives toward. That's what he thinks is at stake. So then what are the arguments that human rights picks up from the exploration of these principles? Well, let's go through and see what he says about them. He claims that the government that silences a minority opinion in accordance with the majority opinion. So in other words, when a government takes the side of a majority opinion to silence a minority, it's all the worse for persecuting the minority. He says, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. So that this act of silencing, this exercise of power to silence others, he says, can never find a justification. The interesting thing, though, is that in this argument, Mill's not especially concerned or primarily concerned with the rights of the opinion holder. So that were the government to silence my speech, his argument would be that's unjust, but unjust not just for me, not only for me, but also for all those who would hear my opinion, would be allowed to consider what it is that I'm saying, would be allowed to hold two opposing opinions or ideas against one another, weigh them up against one another. Right? So that it's not simply me, the speaker, who suffers an injustice, but also the audience who would hear my opinion. And at that, it's especially those who would disagree with me who suffer an injustice. If the opinion is right, he says, they're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. Right? So if my opinion is correct and I'm silenced, then those who disagree with me will not have the opportunity to correct their error by exposure to my opinion. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clear perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. So again, this idea that I was pointing out in points 3 and 4 above, that if I'm wrong and silenced, then those who are right don't get the opportunity to, so to speak, sharpen their idea by putting it into contact with mine, by correcting my error, by, in a way, discovering the depth of the truth that they correctly hold. Beyond that, then, in order to silence another, you have to be persuaded that you are infallible. Mill thinks that that is mistaken on the face of it, that we're all prone to fallibility, we're all prone to error, and so we can't be possessed of that kind of arrogance that would be required to silence another by forcing another into silence. We assume that we cannot be mistaken. So then we must act from the truest opinions that we can, right? So then this is the whole show for him in a way, right? That the way that we arrive at the truest opinions we can is by putting our opinions into opposition with different ideas, working out which is strongest, which is closest to the truth. So then we arrive at the truest opinions that we can through this dialogic process. And then, he says, when we're sure of ourselves, when we've gone through this process of putting our ideas into conflict with other ideas and seeing which one is truest, when we've reached that level of sureness in ourselves, then he says it's cowardly not to act on those opinions of which we're now sure, and by failing to act, allowing doctrines that we think are dangerous to flourish and take the place of the opinions that we think we've now tested and are accurate, true, viable. Still, he points out that there's a difference between feeling assured of the truth of an opinion because you've taken every opportunity to contest it and it remains unrefuted, and on the other hand, forbidding its refutation because you presume it to be true. So the one starts with a presumption and then exercises force on others to silence them, to keep your opinion that you believe to be true from being contested. That is not the same thing, he thinks, as feeling that you're justified in your persuasion about this opinion because you've exposed it to opposing positions and this opinion has prevailed. That's when he thinks you're justified in feeling assured, feeling certain, not when you've simply silenced opposing views. Our remarkable feature, then, he thinks, we humans, is that we can correct our errors, that this is a remarkable capacity that we have. But experience alone is not enough. We need discussion. So then there's a very important principle here. He thinks of this freedom as not the freedom just of the isolated individual, but he thinks of this, again to use language that is not his language, as intersubjective, that this is something that happens between individuals. Why? Because we need to discuss with others. We can't just work all of these things out on our own. So then we can only really rely on judgments once we've tested them, once we've exposed ourselves to opposing views. That's the only time that we can start to feel secure in our judgments. So then, we have a need for freedom of expression, not so much so that we can voice our own opinions. That's valuable, he thinks, but that's not the primary value that we get. It's so that we can hear out opposing views. And by hearing these opposing views, that we can start to get closer to the truth. So it does serve us in the end, but it serves us not simply as the speaker of an opinion, but as the recipient of an opinion, or of multiple opinions, right? So that when we have the opportunity to hear out someone else who disagrees with us, that does us a benefit. So another way to think of this is that if I come into this class and I refuse to hear any opposing views, not only am I probably a very frustrating person for you all to have to deal with because I'm not treating you as if you have anything interesting to say, but also I'm doing myself a disfavor because I'm not allowing myself to expose my ideas to opposition. Now, if it turns out that you can change my mind on something, then I'm indebted to you. You're not my enemy in that case. You're someone who has allowed me to gain greater proximity to the truth. This is the objective toward which Mill thinks freedom of expression allows us. Protecting a belief against attack because of its usefulness is a popular technique. You say, well, belief A may not be true, but it's useful. Say it makes people feel good. It gives them comfort. It keeps people in line. It keeps them from misbehaving. Whatever the case may be, that it's a question of utility. So that it's a tempting and, at his time and in our time, popular way of protecting beliefs is to claim that they're useful. and even to say that that usefulness, that utility, is more important than truth. But this contains its own contradiction. He says, the usefulness of an opinion is itself a matter of opinion, as disputable, as open to discussion, as requiring discussion as much as the opinion itself. So then an opinion's utility rather depends on its truth. His point here then is that utility can't stand in opposition of truth. Rather, an opinion, the closer an opinion is to truth, the more useful it is, the more utility it has. And so then making the case that you have to suppress truth in favor of the usefulness, in favor of the utility of an opinion, he thinks is wrong-headed. It's mistaken. It doesn't understand where utility comes from. It comes from its approximation to the truth. So then he takes belief in God as an example of something protected from opposition because of its perceived usefulness. And he writes quite a bit about Christianity, a little bit about Catholicism, a great deal more about Christianity in general, and then some also about Protestant faiths, Protestantism in general, not any particular variant of Protestantism. But then, so then he takes God as an example of something that is protected from question because it appears useful. But this protection, again, presumes one's own infallibility. It presumes that your understanding of God, your idea of God, cannot be mistaken, that you are, in a sense, perfect in your understanding of God. So again, it runs into that problem of arrogating too much to yourself, being too arrogant about your own powers. But then the real point of his attack is that forbidding counter-argument, by forbidding counter-argument, you, quote, decide the question for others without allowing them to hear what can be said on the contrary side. So you do yourself a disservice in one way if you don't allow the opposing views to God free rein, because you're not allowing yourself to hear them. You're not allowing yourself to go through that process that he's already talked about of honing, of sharpening your own opinions, bringing them closer to the truth through their exposure to competing views. But the worst thing, he thinks, is having the arrogance to think that you can make this decision for others, that is unjust in his view and unfounded. There's no justification that you can have for making that decision for others. So then it's doing a double disservice, a disservice to yourself and the soundness of your own opinions, but a further disservice to others in presuming that you can decide for them what they can and cannot hear. Which again requires a certain kind of hubris, right? A certain kind of persuasion that you cannot be mistaken about this thing. So there's a further dimension to this religious example that he takes. The legal standing at that time of atheists. And indeed, this has been the case in the US until not that long ago in many states. So then, at that time, atheists were denied the right to give evidence in court. And by doing that, then, they would be denied justice. Because if, say, they were accused of something and were the only ones who could testify on their own behalf, they wouldn't have that right. They would be denied the right to testify on their own behalf. He thinks that there's a paradox here as well, that the oath is worthless of a person who does not believe in a future state. That he thinks that idea carries with it a paradox. So he says, under pretense that atheists must be liars, it admits the testimony of all atheists who are willing to lie and rejects only those who brave the obloquy of publicly confessing a detested creed rather than affirm a falsehood. So just to be sure that what he's saying is clear there, is he's saying that all those atheists who would take the hazard of publicly declaring their atheism, even though they know that being openly atheist will be bad for them, it will harm their social standing. So even rejecting those ones who are willing to publicly declare that, and instead accepting only those atheists who are going to lie and say that they're believers. That's the outcome of this particular conviction. The position then implies that religious people only refrain from lying out of fear of hell and not out of conviction. In other words, there's a certain compromise to the character of the religious person here, right? A compromise that the open atheist does not have. That there's a way that the open atheist is being more honest in declaring his or her atheism to the world. But there's a further thing. He doesn't exactly say this, but I think it's a further implication of what he's pointing to here. And that is that if the only atheists who are allowed to testify are those who are going to lie and say that they're believers, believe in an afterlife, then in effect you can't trust anybody who gets on the stand and says that they believe in an afterlife, because any one of them could be exactly the atheist that you're trying to exclude from the court. So the irony then, the paradox of this, is that it in fact sows doubt about the validity of anybody who takes the stand, except for that atheist who declares his or her atheism publicly, but is not allowed to testify. So then again, you can see that the idea of utility here, the utility of protecting the idea of God, just doesn't work out in the way that the would-be protectors would like. In fact, what it does is it substitutes the suppression of truth for truth, and it keeps those who are most inclined to tell the truth from actually getting up and speaking it. Again, it's not just an injustice to the open atheist who's not allowed to testify in his or her own behalf, but it's an injustice to the community as a whole, because it undermines the ability of everyone to trust that the person who's on the stand is in fact speaking the truth. It undermines the whole function of the court then. Okay, anyway, moving along. So he says, following along the track of religion and suppression of speech, he points out that it is not the minds of heretics that are most compromised by bans on heretical speech. Rather, it's the non-heretics whose mental development is stunted by their fear of heresy. Stunted because they're unwilling to hear opposing views, and therefore are incapable of trying out their own opinions against resistance, and thereby strengthening their own views, becoming more attuned to the truth. The development of great thinkers, he says, depends on the willingness to consider dangerous ideas. But the threat is also to average thinkers. He says, not that it is solely or chiefly to form great thinkers that freedom of thinking is required. So that's not the primary goal. It's a happy outcome, but it's not the primary goal. On the contrary, it is as much, even more, indispensable to enable average human beings to attain the mental stature which they are capable of. There have been, and may again be, great individual thinkers in a general atmosphere of mental slavery, right? So you can imagine that in an environment that is suppressing free thought, you can still have great thinkers who will emerge here and there. So you could think of, if you take Martin Luther King Jr. as an example of a great thinker, at least someone who had a great facility for articulating clearly the quest for freedom, then you can see then that even in an oppressive atmosphere, a great thinker can arise. He goes on, though, Mill does. But there never has been, nor ever will be, in that atmosphere, an intellectually active people. So then the populace as a whole will not be intellectually active under these conditions that are oppressive, that are restraining free speech. That's the thing that he thinks is truly damaging, truly harmful, is this suppression of the great bulk of people who are not geniuses, who are not the Einsteins of the world, say, but rather than the average people who are not able to realize their full potential, either individually or collectively, because they're not allowed to refine their arguments, refine their opinions through this free exchange of ideas. And certainly then it becomes even harder for them to appreciate the greatness of great thinkers. So then, even in cases where the received opinion is true, Mill argues, if it doesn't face full, frequent, and fearless interrogation, it will just become dogmatic. And in that way, it won't be a living truth for the people who hold it. It will be something they receive as dogma and profess as dogma, as essentially unconsidered, in other words. So he goes on to explain the importance of exposure to opposing positions. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. So let's just pause there for a moment. So if you only know your own side of an argument, he's saying, you barely even know your own side. Why? Because you haven't tested it out. You haven't seen the depth of it. You haven't seen the different angles of it that you can learn about only through exposing it to opposing ideas. He goes on then. If he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either side. So if you hold a view without knowing the opposing side, or without exposing your ideas to opposition, if, to use the current terminology, if you live in an echo chamber, then you're depriving yourself of any good reason to believe in the opinion that you hold. You don't know what the alternatives are. You don't know if there's something stronger, more persuasive out there. So then you've got no reason for preferring either one side or the other. The failure then to continue thinking about things that are no longer in doubt leads to, he says, the deep slumber of a decided opinion. Right? That there's a way that no longer going through the effort of considering a settled truth leads to a certain kind of intellectual laziness, this slumber of decided opinion. What we're left with then is just accepting our premises from authority. We take it from authority and just accept it, rather than from reason, right? So that we're not reasoning through our way through our opinion in the face of opposition and seeing what the genuine strengths of our position are. We're just taking them from authority in that case. unable then to sort of breathe life into them under our own steam, we always have to defer to the authority and say, well, person X says it's so, so therefore it's so. But then, what's the problem with that? Well, just as nobody is in a position to decide for others what opinions they should hear, much less hold, when we allow authority to give us our ideas and just accept things on authority, we presume that the authority is infallible as well. We surrender our own judgment to the authority. In a sense, then, simultaneously we presume the infallibility of the authority, and we completely diminish our own judgment, our own capacity to reason, our own ability to work out ideas for ourselves. We diminish ourselves in the same gesture that we overinflate the authority from whom we accept these ideas and opinions. So then Mill has considered the value of diversity of opinion in two ways. When received opinion may be false, another opinion is therefore true. When received opinion is true, opposition is, he says, essential to clear apprehension and deep feeling of its truth. Right? So that when the opinion that we've received, say from authority, meets opposition, that does us the service of allowing us to generate this depth of understanding of the truth of the opinion. We no longer have a shallow sense of what the opinion is. We have an appreciation of its depth. And so anybody who's been in an argument and starts professing a position that you've heard recently that sounded good, but you haven't really had the time to think it through very thoroughly, and then met somebody who's opposing you, who sees some aspect of that argument that you just haven't been able to think about for yourself yet, and exposes the problem with that. Anybody who's been in that position knows that having a shallow understanding of an opinion, even though it seems right to you, is a humiliating experience when it's revealed to be so shallow. Why? Because then you don't have that sort of depth of understanding to resort to bolster the opinion and to explain why it is that, no, actually this is an opinion well worth having. It's a sound opinion. It's robust, powerful, meaningful, and so forth. Most often, though, conflicting opinions share the truth. So this is what he thinks when he says that prevailing opinion is seldom the whole truth. That it's very often the case that different opinions will have a portion of the truth each. Neither one will have the full truth. Each will have a portion of the truth. He says then, the non-conforming opinion is needed to supply the remainder of the truth, of which the received doctrine or the accepted doctrine embodies only part, so that there can be, through the conflict of differing opinions, something, a way that they can supplement one another to gain greater access to the whole truth. Thus, Mill thinks that on any great question, any of the big pressing questions, when one opinion is more generally accepted, it is all the more important to encourage the minority opinion. Again, because the generally accepted opinion will in all likelihood only possess a portion of the truth, and it will benefit from receiving the opposition of the minority opinion that will contain another portion of the truth. And thereby the two together can more closely approximate the truth in a way that neither one on its own can do. So then, the truth is the loser in the suppression of dissident views. And so, by extension, the victims are not just the dissidents who are silenced, but all those who might hear the silenced opinion. Why? Because all those who could otherwise hear this opinion, if it were not suppressed, gain greater access to the truth in this way. And as he's pointed out previously, the truth is the thing that has real utility for us. That's where the utility of opinions comes from. The dissenting opinion is vital, therefore, and Mill would not even constrain it by demanding that it be stated inoffensively. He makes great latitude for offensive speech. Well, in part because whenever an attack is especially powerful, it will be felt to be offensive. Not to the one giving it, to the one receiving it. Right? Any attack that exposes a weakness in an opinion or exposes how fallacious a position is going to feel offensive. It injures our pride. We feel humiliated. We find that offensive, right? On the whole, people don't really enjoy being corrected all that much. But being corrected is, following Mill anyway, is the only way that you'll actually weed out the errors in your thinking and become more oriented to the truth, have greater access to the truth. But that process will feel offensive when you run into a sternly stated opinion contrary to your own that exposes the weakness in your own. The worst offense, though, to Mill is to stigmatize as immoral those who hold a contrary view, especially when it's the minority view. And this is one of the points that he wants to make about offense, is that it's regularly the case that those who try to constrain people to speak inoffensively are the ones who hold the majority opinion. And they take as offensive anything that contests their majority opinion. So that what they wind up doing then is stigmatizing the holders of the minority opinion, the contrary position, as immoral. It's a way of dismissing them, a way of excluding them from the conversation in advance, so that the dogma that you hold so dear can go uncontested, even with all of the errors that it's going to continue to possess. So then what we've seen so far is that the value of discussion for Mill is not simply that it gives one who holds an opinion the right to express that opinion, but it gives that person the opportunity to validate the opinion that he or she holds, right? By testing it against other ideas. And further, it gives the audience who would receive the opinion that would otherwise be suppressed that opportunity to work out for themselves or collectively in their own discussions what seems the most persuasive to them, what it is that convinces them, and to work out why something is convincing, to develop that depth of understanding of what makes an opinion a persuasive opinion. Okay, so that is the first chapter. In the next, we'll move on to Mill's thinking of individuality and individualism. Whoops.